Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I talk a lot about biases on this channel, about how everybody has them, because we all do. Whether we recognize them, whether we acknowledge them, or whether we're just completely blind to them. And why do we have biases? Because every one of us has a unique story, depending on what country we live in, what part of that country we live in, even what part of a city we live in, or part of a state that we live in. What our socioeconomic background is, our race, our religion, the traumas that we experienced growing up, just how we've been hurt and how we've hurt others. And I mean, there's just endless factors that determine our worldview and determine how we see things. And how do I know that? Because two people can take a look at the exact same story, situation, event, person, and walk away with a completely different view on things. Two people can watch a presidential debate. One will think that the Democrat won, and the other one will be sure that the Democrat was terrible and that the Republican clearly won. Why? Because of biases. We all have those. And so I thought this was a really interesting topic in view of that. From Sideprojects, it's called Historical Events that are taught completely differently in other countries. And you would think on the surface, well, wait a second, history is history. How can it be taught differently in one country to another? Well, easy, because of bias, because of worldview. You know, if I'm teaching about, for example, the Napoleonic Wars in France, it's going to be taught very differently than if I'm teaching about the Napoleonic Wars in a place like Austria or England. Why? Because Napoleon's not on our side, he's on the other side. The American Revolution, which really is a war for independence rather than kind of a revolution in the first place, is going to be taught very differently in the United States than it is in England. It's a seminal, it's a pivotal, essential moment that we're going to focus a lot about in American history. For people in England, not nearly as big a deal. It's just one of many such events that happen in their history. So I'll put the link down in the description. As always, our friend Simon Whistler is going to be the one narrating this one. I think this will be a really interesting topic to take a look at. Let's dive in.
There's an old saying that history is written by the winners. However, this adage is far more relevant when it comes to ancient civilizations. Thousands of years ago, it was far more common for the losers of a war to be completely eradicated or absorbed, and even in cases where that didn't happen, records from the larger, more powerful empire are more likely to be the ones that survive for millennia.
That's a great point, that history written by the victors definitely applies to ancient empires, but not recent. How do I know? The lost cause. The narrative that still is pervasive in large parts of the country, particularly in the American South, that has a very different view of the history of the American Civil War than was written by the victors in the North.
But in modern times, where it is rare for a war to result in the absorption or dissolution of entire nation states, both sides of a conflict have the opportunity to write their own history books. In general, these books will have wildly different accounts of what happened and why.
Yeah.
So today, we'll be looking at 4 historical events that are taught completely differently in other countries.
And I would say that's not a bad thing. You know, I wish we had, for example, the account of Vercingetorix from the Gallic Wars and not just Julius Caesar's account. Because I would love to compare and contrast and see, what did Caesar really inflate? What did they agree on? You know, because when you have those conflicting accounts, somewhere in the middle is probably the truth. And especially where you see overlap and both sides saying the same thing, that's pretty neat when that happens.
The American Revolution is one of the most important events in American history. Without it, the United States wouldn't even be its own country. It's where elementary school history class begins in the US, and they learn about the heroes and patriots that fought against a tyrannical British government to forever free themselves from the monarchy and create the greatest nation the world has ever seen.
Yeah, so all of what he just said, obviously, and I think that's Philadelphia there, is exactly how it's taught in American schools, or at least it was for me growing up. All of those things, absolutely true. And it's not that there's anything necessarily incorrect about any of that. Just some of it's opinion. Some of it is a viewpoint. It's not an incorrect viewpoint, it's just a viewpoint. and others might see it differently. And a lot of times you'll notice that on this channel, especially when I talk about events like the American Revolution, that I will often push back against that narrative. Not because I don't love my country, because I do, with our flaws and everything, and I'm a very patriotic American. But I think it's important to try and help people to understand that this is not the only way to view these events.
Very even-handed representation of events, unclouded by nationalism. But how is the American Revolution, or as they call it, the American War of Independence,
which is more accurate
to British school children?
Why is that more accurate? Because a revolution really describes kind of like the French Revolution. That was the people of France changing their system of government. The War of Independence is one part of a system of government breaking away and forming its own government, not changing the government of Great Britain.
Learn about the band of ungrateful terrorists who revolted against the crown because they didn't want to pay their fair share of taxes like the rest of the British Empire? Are they taught about brave heroes like Benedict Arnold, Joseph Galloway, and Thomas Hutchinson with the same level of detail and mythos with which American children learn about Paul Revere,
Paul Revere, a.k.a. Jack Black.
With the same level of detail and mythos with which American children...
Tell me that is not Jack Black. Come on. But no, I mean, and again, is any of that wrong? Is any of that wrong? Could you view things like the Boston Tea Party as terrorism? Absolutely. I mean, that's an extreme viewpoint, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but it is a viewpoint that you could see. You know, the military was sent out from Boston to grab weapons at Concord that were being stored up for an armed rebellion against the government. That's true. These people were, in fact, traitors by rebelling against the government, by fighting against, and by not submitting to the king and to the lawful authorities. All true.
And learn about Paul Revere, Patrick Henry, and George Washington. Now, once upon a time, that may have been true, and there are accounts of older British texts describing the American colonists as being ungrateful for the protection and economic benefits that England had provided them. However, it's been a long time since that was the case. To start, the Americans and the British have been extremely close allies for much longer than anyone watching this video has been alive.
That's true. And what tends to happen, and I've said this about recent events, and this is why we talk about recency bias and why it's really difficult, for example, to rate a president from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because we're so close to the events that there's still a lot of emotion and there's still a lot of heavy bias involved. As you get further away, and I'm talking 100 years or more away, the biases start to fade and you start to see a more, I don't want to say neutral viewpoint, but a more tempered viewpoint. And so, okay, maybe we're not going to call them terrorists now. We might still say, you know what, we don't agree with their choice to rebel, but here are some of the reasons why they did. And you know, on the other side, okay, maybe Great Britain wasn't the extreme despotism that Thomas Jefferson wanted to describe it as. You know, and those things get tempered over time.
There are no longer any hard feelings between the two nations, even if you can't pronounce maths correctly. So there's no reason for England to propagandize the war to make the United States look like horrible villains. More importantly, though, the war just isn't that important to the British. To Americans, The American Revolution was fought for freedom, democracy, and the right to self-governance. It was the event that led to the creation of the United States, and the battles were fought within the nation's borders, and many of these are now national landmarks.
So I just want to take a minute and comment on this. This is a painting of the Constitutional Convention. So you got George Washington up there. He was the president of that convention. And I don't know, there's something about the way Alexander Hamilton is staring at Benjamin Franklin in the center of this painting that I find fascinating. It just seems like a very Hamilton thing to do. And Franklin just like, whatever, I don't care. He's like 90 years old at this point. But no, he's right. I mean, the American Revolution in the end is a pivotal event to Americans, but it's just not that big a deal to British people.
Nothing could be more important to Americans and the history of their nation. But to the British, one of their colonies rising up and revolting against British rule was just another Tuesday.
Yep,
and from
exactly.
the British perspective, the American Revolution was hardly the most important of the colonial rebellions. That was all happening an ocean away, and there were colonies closer to home that had a much greater impact on the empire. Today, the American Revolution is little more than a footnote in British classrooms. It is mostly seen as being important not because it was yet another colony that England was losing control of, but because of France's involvement in the war.
Yeah, and likewise, Americans, many of us, myself included, my heritage is primarily from England and Scotland. The English Civil War, much more important to modern day British people just because of the impact that it had on their nation today. But to Americans, I don't even know if most Americans know there was an English Civil War. We just talk about the Civil War, and we obviously mean the American Civil War.
Wanting revenge for their defeat during the 7 Years' War, France provided financial and military support to the colonists, hoping it could serve as a sort of proxy war against England. The burden of financing this war created an economic crisis that, when combined with the revolutionary ideology French soldiers brought back from the colonies, paved the way for the French Revolution.
Yep.
Because of its close...
It's all tied together. We say that all the time. Without the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, we call it here, there is no American Revolution. Without the American Revolution, there is no French Revolution. Without the French Revolution, there's no Napoleonic Wars, and on it goes.
Proximity to England and the large impact it had on Europe as a whole, the French Revolution is seen as far more important from a historical perspective, and the American Revolution is just some extra context for that event that teachers may or may not even bother to mention. Sticking with US-British relations for a moment, let's jump forward a few decades, what is sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence. Beginning in June of 1812, and not officially ending until February of 1815, the War of 1812 can best be described as a dumb and pointless waste of lives and resources.
Yep.
This is best exemplified by the Treaty of Ghent, the peace agreement that restored status quo ante bellum, Latin for the situation as it existed before the war.
So I get so frustrated because I talk to a lot of Americans who are convinced that the United States won the War of 1812. So really quickly, and I'm sure he's going to cover some of this, the United States, we declared that war. So we started it. We declared war on now the United Kingdom at this point. We invade Canada and that fails. Our capital gets burned. The only major, really significant victory, I mean, there's a few. We win the Battle of Lake Erie is a naval victory up in northwest Ohio, right near Sandusky. So that was kind of a big deal, but it's only a few ships involved in that. Battle of New Orleans takes place after the Treaty of Ghent has been agreed to. They just haven't heard a word of it yet. So in the end, you have, 20,000 Americans die. Our capital gets burned. We gain nothing, and we get the status quo afterwards. Failed invasion of Canada. We declared the war. How in any measurement can that be classified as a victory? Well, people claim, because we took on the British. Yeah, but we chose to take on the British. We didn't have to do that. And the British were in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars during most of that.
It was agreed that everything would go back to the way it was before the fighting began, with no change in territorial borders. Not only did neither nation gain anything as a result of the war, but the treaty also failed to address any of the concerns that caused the war to arise in the first place, meaning that nothing was actually resolved. Despite the war being fought to a stalemate, it remains a point of national pride for the United States. The war began thanks to England not wanting the US to trade with their rival France. British ships would board the American merchant ships and impress the sailors into the Royal Navy, which the US saw as violation of its independence. Because this is sometimes...
I mean, it is. It absolutely is. If you're stopping a sovereign nation's ships and taking their sailors and putting them into service on your ships, that's absolutely... that's kidnapping.
Viewed as the Second War of Independence, and because the United States did not fall back under British rule, it is safe to assume that many Americans view the War of 1812 as successful. Though some schools do teach that it ended in a stalemate, many teach it as a US victory. More important, it is the origin of some of America's greatest legends. The lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, the US national anthem, come from Francis Scott Key's poem about the Battle of Baltimore during the war.
And another thing... The number of Americans I encounter who think that the Star-Spangled Banner refers to the Revolution, it's insane.
The story of Andrew Jackson's major military victory at the Battle of Orleans, even though the peace treaty had already been signed before.
Now, that said, the Battle of New Orleans, and if you go to the battlefield, it's really cool, and you can understand why the Americans won when you go to the battlefield there. It's really like the battlefield was so bad for the British side, and the casualties are so incredibly one-sided, and the British commander is killed. So yeah, it propels Andrew Jackson to national prominence, but really doesn't do much else.
For the battle. Oh, and the British also burned down the White House, but Americans
and the
tried
Capitol.
to focus on that. But most importantly, the war is seen as solidifying the United States as a major player on the international stage. They may not have won the war, but they took on the British Empire and didn't lose, which was
a British Empire that was in the middle of fighting against Napoleonic France.
After winning as far as the fledgling nation was concerned. For England's part, they care even less about this war than they did about the American Revolution, and it rarely receives any attention in schools there. In Canada, however, it is completely different. Canada was a British colony at the time, and much of the fighting took place between troops along the US-Canada border.
And why is this? Because in the Revolutionary War, there was an attempt very early on to try and absorb Canada into the United States, because it was just another colony, right? So there was hope that they could get Canada to also break away. And so, for example, you send General Montgomery along with Benedict Arnold up to attack Quebec, and that fails miserably. And so that was the immediate goal. It's an opportunity to invade Canada, and it goes terribly. I think we did burn York, which is modern-day Toronto, at one point.
And neighboring cities. To Canadians, the War of 1812 is a really big deal. Students in the US are taught that they won the war, but it's also not a major focus. The entire war is usually covered in 2 or 3 days, and then classes move on to do other things. But in Canada, students can expect to spend 3 to 4 months learning about their victorious defense against the invading Americans. Much of the population of Canada was made up of British loyalists who fled the United States after the American Revolution, and the War of 1812 is seen as fundamental in creating a national identity for Canadians. After all, there weren't a lot of British troops occupying the area at the time, so most of the fighting was done by Canadian militias and their Indigenous allies. From this arose the figures that would become Canadian folk heroes. Heroes like Laura II, a Massachusetts-born loyalist who fled to Canada. When invading American soldiers were quartered in her home, she overheard their plans and walked 20 miles through harsh terrain to warn British soldiers. Or Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief and warrior who had formed an intertribal confederacy that fought alongside the Canadians to prevent further American expansion. And of course, there were more traditional war heroes as well, like General Isaac Brock of the British Army. So while the War of 1812 accomplished nothing, the United States didn't fall back under British rule, and Canada wasn't annexed by the United States. As such, both sides claimed it as a victory and continued to teach it that way, though in Canada there is a much stronger emphasis on the war than in the United States.
That makes a lot of sense, and I know we have a lot of Canadian viewers, so if you're from Canada, let me know. How much did you learn about the War of 1812 growing up? Oh, interesting. This I don't know. How is this viewed?
There have been a lot of controversies surrounding Japanese textbooks and their attempts to whitewash the actions of Imperial Japan during World War II and the Second Sino-Japanese War. There's certainly good reason for the controversy as well. While Germany is often seen as the paragon of education, or when it comes to a nation properly teaching about a war they lost without shying away.
That's absolutely true. I hear that over and over again, and I experienced some of that myself. When I was at Dachau outside of Munich in Germany, a bunch of school groups there. I mean, they are really adamant in Germany about making sure that they acknowledge and that they're training these students growing up to understand what their own country did and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. I think it's a really powerful example. And I think we as Americans, for example, could learn a few things about that in terms of how we teach about what happened with indigenous peoples, for example, and with slavery.
From even the most horrific details of their own actions, Japan is an extreme example of the other direction. Thanks to Japan's fundamental law of education, there is a textbook authorization system that requires all textbooks to receive approval from the Ministry of Education. Although no one specific textbook is forced on students, schools can only choose to use textbooks that have been properly vetted by the ministry. Now, at first blush, that doesn't sound too crazy. It's easy to argue that the Ministry of Education is ensuring that textbooks are of an appropriate standard, lest students receive books teaching them that 1 times 1 is 2. However, the ministry has used this authority to remove anything they deem objectionable from history books. This is problematic when it comes to teaching about World War II, because the Japanese famously committed a whole lot of war crimes, from murdering civilians to biological warfare experiments, killing prisoners of war to abducting women and girls for sexual slavery. It seemed that there was nothing that was off limits for the Imperial Japanese Army. Combine the atrocities committed by their military with the fact that Japan was on the losing side of the war, and it turns out that they would just prefer not to talk about it.
Oh, okay, so we're just gonna let it be. I'm not totally surprised by that. And again, this is a different culture. Germany and Japan are very different cultures in terms of just how they view life, how they view honor, and those sorts of things. And so this doesn't really surprise me.
Textbooks barely cover those years at all. One textbook had only 19 pages covering all of 1931 to 1945, which encompassed both World War II and the Sino-Japanese War. Amidst that, there was only a single sentence covering the atomic bombs, which should make it clear the level of detail, or lack thereof, that these history books were going into. As historian Stephen Ambrose famously put it in his book, To America, Personal Reflections of a Historian, quote, "The Japanese presentation of the war to its children runs something like this. One day, for no reason we ever understood, the Americans started dropping atomic bombs on us." However, there's actually another interesting difference about Japan and World War II when it comes to Russia. In the United States, and indeed much of the West, it is taught that the Japanese surrendered because the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Now, again, this is one of those things, though, that isn't incorrect, because the emperor himself acknowledged that the use of atomic bombs was a key factor in the surrender. Was it the only factor? No, certainly. I mean, a nuanced view knows that, for example, the Soviets had declared war on Japan and were starting to gain territory, and that there were other factors at play. But I don't think it's wrong to teach that. That is the traditional view, is that we dropped the bombs. The focus on pushing for Japan to surrender was on, hey, we're going to drop more of these bombs. So that was the general understanding at the time.
Russian textbooks, that's not the reason.
Oh, that makes sense. Instead, the Russians are going to say, well, it was us. We jumped in on the war.
They take credit for defeating Japan. A quick timeline for context here. The bombing of Hiroshima occurred on the 6th of August. On the 8th of August, Stalin officially declared war against Japan. On August the 9th, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The same day, just hours before the bomb was dropped, Russian soldiers engaged the Japanese in Manchuria. Within 10 days, the Russians had plowed their way through the Imperial Japanese forces occupying the Asian continent, and they were ready to push onward to mainland Japan. While it wouldn't be fair to say that Russia's march toward mainland Japan was inconsequential, the idea that Russian aggression, rather than the threat of total nuclear annihilation, was the determining factor in Japan's surrender is a minority opinion that seems...
It is, but again, if I'm a Russian and I'm trying to instill pride in my country, I can see why I spin it that way.
Relegated almost entirely to Russian textbooks.
Interesting. This will be interesting.
Most of you watching this are too old to have learned about the 9/11 attacks from a textbook, instead having lived through it. How the events are handled in schools in the US isn't fully standardized yet.
I will say this before he even gets into this. I've noticed, and some of you who are of the generation that my kids are, that are watching, but also those who have kids of that generation may have noticed this, that we've reached in the last couple of years the stage where there's a generation now that kind of is lighthearted toward 9/11, that make jokes about it. I see that a lot with my kids' generation. And they didn't live through it. They're not old enough to remember it. I mean, kids in high school today weren't even born yet when it happened. My son was born in 2007, and he's a junior in high school. They're now learning about this from textbooks.
There are a few consistent elements about how it is taught in school. To start, lessons about 9/11 are taught on the anniversary of the attacks as a memorializing event. It is generally taught in a simplistic and nationalistic way, focusing on how it was a shocking and unprecedented attack on US soil that resulted in the global community at large standing beside the US in their efforts to combat the terrorists responsible for the attacks. A lot of emphasis is also placed on the heroism of the first responders.
And I think, too, that's how it's viewed in our culture in general. I mean, that's how we present it in the news. It's how our documentaries present it. I think that's generally the American view on these events.
Of whom lost their lives that day or in the years that followed as a result of health complications resulting from the rescue efforts. There will frequently be personal testimonials as well, with teachers or guest speakers talking about their memories and emotions from the day the attacks happened. However, because US history classes are taught chronologically and September the 11th falls at the beginning of the school year, the events of that day are taught out of order so that the day itself can be memorialized. That means that there is no surrounding context about American actions in the Middle East in the decades leading up to the attacks or the war that followed them, and only a very simplistic view of a shocked world unifying to stand behind the United States.
That actually makes a lot of sense. And again, you can teach those events without blaming those events. In other words, to say here's the context and here's American involvement in the Middle East and here's all the events that went before and this is what led to the terrorist actions, it isn't saying, well, it makes sense. Of course they did that. It's not justifying murder of innocent people. It never is. It shouldn't be. But context does matter in that situation.
In some schools, the narrative is even as simple as terrorists attack the United States because they hate freedom. Around the world, however, how the attacks are taught varies greatly depending on that country's relationship with the United States and the religious makeup of the nation. Countries with whom the US has somewhat strained relations may be far more critical of the US response. Although acts of terror are universally condemned, at least in official textbooks, these nations often focus more on the aftermath of the attacks and the perceived illegality of the United States' actions afterwards, particularly the war in Iraq.
I was going to say, I think generally there's a more sympathetic view toward the U.S. actions in Afghanistan that began, I think, in October of that year. Obviously, March 2003, the war in Iraq begins, and that is viewed very differently, not only by the world, but even here in the United States today. I think most people now, in hindsight, recognize that that was not a great idea and that it really just made more problems, not only for America, but for the people of Iraq even. But I think Afghanistan, at least at the time, was viewed very differently.
Countries, textbooks don't refer to the attackers as Islamic fundamentalists, with varying degrees of obfuscation. For example, in Pakistani textbooks, they are described as unidentified terrorists, while Turkish textbooks contain the attackers' names but omit the
We literally know who all of them were. Most of them were Saudi.
Muslim. These textbooks also tend to focus heavily on the civilian casualties in the wars that followed 9/11 and how the war on terror disproportionately affected Muslim countries. There are smaller differences as well, down to individual word choices. Depending on how they want to present the events, the words attackers or terrorists might be replaced with the word individuals. Accurately describing the events while using words with incredibly different connotations allows textbook authors to subtly influence how the events might be perceived by readers.
That's actually a really fascinating observation. And that's not only true for that, that's true in general, right? Just the choice of words that we use. And it's constantly changing. For example, one I've used in this video today and talking about, growing up, the term Indian was mostly the one that we used to refer to what we now call indigenous peoples. And then we went through a phase where it was Native American. Now it's indigenous peoples. And that seems to be the word that is used around the world for who was there before other people settled that place. And the same thing is true for lots of different events and lots of different groups of people. And it'll change again.
But while different countries emphasize different aspects of 9/11 and the related events, perhaps the most disparate recounting of events comes from China. In China, 9/11 is taught as a sign that America's dominance as the world's #1 superpower was coming to an end, largely glossing over the impact of terrorism around the world and instead focusing on geopolitical shifts from the perceived weakening of the US. All of that said, we're likely to see shifts over time in how the events leading up to, on, and following 9/11 are taught around the world. It's extremely rare for an event to make it into history textbooks less than a decade after it happened, meaning that none of the surrounding context is presented alongside it. In time, the disparities in how the events are taught around the world may disappear, but there's no telling how long that will take or how similar the various accounts will become.
So yeah, just like I said with how we view, for example, presidents here in the United States, the geopolitical stuff will lessen over time, right? Who knows 50 years from now who China and the United States will see as their big rivals. And so maybe there's a strong alliance between the countries, which existed during World War II, for example. And so maybe then those narratives start to change again. Maybe the United States and Britain or the United States and Canada have a falling out. And so things start to get told differently than they are now. Who knows? What do you think? What's another example? I mean, there's lots of other examples of events that are taught differently in one country to another. And I know this was very heavily focused on the United States, so give me some perspective from other countries. How are things that maybe, for example, are taught in England that are taught differently than how they're taught in Egypt? You know, those kinds of things. So use the comment section and give us some examples. Also, just if you haven't already checked it out, there's lots of links in the description of every video, including links to my other channels, but also links to our upcoming group trips. We still have lots of available spots on our Italy trip coming up in April, and we've got, I think, about a dozen spots left on the Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Czechia trip that is coming at the end of April, beginning of May. So check those out. And I think you can book for like $500 or something. You can reserve your spot. So thanks for watching.